county registry office glowed with fluorescent light that buzzed like static against the winter silence outside. Victoria Sinclair swept through the doors, snow melting on the shoulders of her charcoal coat. Her gloved hand locked around the wrist of a stranger. Derek Callahan barely had time to register the marble counter before papers slid across its surface edges aligned with surgical precision. "Marry me. 5 minutes." Her voice carried no plea, only the sharp focus of someone running from something she could not name. 34 years old and chief executive of Hayes Global Industries, a financial and technology conglomerate worth $4 billion, Victoria Sinclair had built her reputation on discipline enforced through silence. In boardrooms, she ended discussions with verdicts that left executives both respectful and afraid. The public knew her as a woman who spoke little and delivered much. Someone with no scandals, no public romances, no visible fractures in the armor she wore like a second skin. But armor could trap as easily as it protected. Victoria's mother had died when she was young, leaving her to grow up in a dynasty where marriage contracts mattered more than wedding vows. She had learned to hate being controlled, yet control defined every corner of her existence. The worst control came wrapped in legal language her father had left behind. A trust fund holding the company's core voting shares with a single devastating condition before her 35th birthday. Victoria had to establish family stability through legal marriage, or the voting rights would transfer to a supervisory committee controlled by the board of directors. She would remain chief executive in title, only a puppet waiting for the strings to be cut. The condition had been buried deep in confidential files known only to a handful of internal lawyers. But someone had stolen those files. Someone inside her own organization had leaked the trust documents and was preparing to activate the clause. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. If Victoria married someone from high society, the media would trace the connection and her opponents would prove the marriage was fake, designed solely to maintain power. She needed someone outside the game entirely. Someone whose legal history was clean but whose social standing made him impossible to connect to corporate manipulation. Derek Callahan was 36 years old and worked as an independent electrician, taking contracts for public building repairs and emergency calls. He lived with his daughter Isla in a small apartment where every dollar had a purpose and every promise had weight. His wife Sarah had died in a traffic accident 4 years ago when Isla was 3, leaving behind medical bills that still shadowed his credit report. Derek had learned to be wary of anything involving large sums of money, and he despised the feeling of powerlessness. Fixing broken electrical systems gave him a sense of control in a world that had taken too much from him already. He did not seek charity and had no tolerance for people who used power like a weapon. Tonight he had promised to be home by 6 to help with a Christmas craft project. That promise mattered more than any emergency repair call. Isla Callahan, 7 years old, with her mother's observant eyes, had established a family ritual with her father. Every night before bed, she asked 3 questions. What made you happiest today? What made you saddest today? What do you want to change tomorrow? The questions were not complicated, but they required honesty. Isla did not need wealth. She needed someone who knew how to listen. The forces working against Victoria had names and faces. Marcus Thornton chaired the board of directors with polished manners that concealed a hunger for control. He had spent years building networks among shareholders, lawyers, and media contacts, all positioned to seize the voting rights Victoria was about to lose. His lieutenant Reginald Kemp served as chief financial officer and specialized in manipulating numbers to create artificial crisis. He hated Victoria for cutting off his shadowy contracts years earlier. Together they had orchestrated this moment, counting down to her 35th birthday like wolves waiting for winter to weaken their prey. Vivian Ashford, an internal corporate lawyer, occupied neutral ground for now. She followed the law precisely, neither helping nor hindering the trap closing around Victoria. But neutrality could shift when the right pressure was applied. The night Victoria and Derek first crossed paths, an electrical failure had darkened the county administrative building where civil records were processed. The main server went down, security cameras flickered, and automated entrance gates stopped functioning. Derek arrived in worn work clothes with snow melting in his hair, called in on an emergency contract to restore power. Victoria appeared an hour later to handle urgent legal paperwork related to the trust fund, dressed in a coat that cost more than Derek's monthly rent. Her face looked carved from ice, every muscle held tight against some invisible weight. She mistook him for a building employee she could direct. Her first words were instructions delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. She needed power restored in 10 minutes because she had an important call. Derek's response came flat and factual. Rushing the job could burn out the circuit board and collapse the entire system tomorrow. He would do it correctly, not quickly. The refusal caught Victoria off balance. She had spent her entire life giving orders and watching people follow them. This man in his faded work jacket had just placed safety above her authority, as if her position meant nothing compared to doing the job right. Something small and sharp lodged itself in her chest. Not quite anger, closer to grudging respect. While Derek worked, he made a video call home to tell Isla to go to bed without him. His daughter's face filled the small screen, and she asked her 3 questions in a voice still soft with childhood. When did you feel happiest today? When the school called to say you got an A on your science project? When did you feel saddest? Right now, because I'm not there to read with you. What do you want to change tomorrow? I want to finish work faster so we have more time together. Victoria heard the conversation from 10 feet away. She did not understand how a man this exhausted could still speak with such warmth, how he could be so present in his answers. Envy touched her briefly, a feeling she refused to name. Before leaving, Victoria glanced at the contractor badge clipped to Derek's tool bag. She did not thank him. Instead, she issued a statement that sounded like a command. If she called again, he would prioritize her requests. Derek nodded without promising anything. Victoria walked out into the snow, carrying his name in her mind like a coin she might need to spend later. 3 weeks later, the emergency board meeting felt less like corporate governance and more like an execution. The conference room stretched long and narrow, its windows overlooking a city wrapped in winter gray. Marcus Thornton called the session under the guise of addressing governance risks and leadership stability. He spoke in careful language about Victoria's private life, creating shareholder concerns, letting the implications hang in the air without explicit accusation. Every word sounded reasonable on the surface, but underneath ran the current of a threat. Reginald Kemp followed with a presentation full of inflated market volatility numbers, graphs colored in alarming red, suggesting that Victoria's personal instability made her unfit to hold decisive voting power. He clicked through slides showing stock fluctuations that had nothing to do with her leadership, but everything to do with manufactured fear. The other board members shifted in their leather chairs, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the narrative being constructed around them. Then the legal strike came. A board attorney casually mentioned the condition in Victoria's father's will, the clause requiring marriage before age 35. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, and Victoria felt her lungs stop working. She had known about the condition but believed it was sealed under absolute confidentiality, protected by attorney-client privilege and locked away in secure files. Someone had betrayed her from inside her own legal fortress. Someone had handed her enemies the exact weapon they needed, and they were wielding it with surgical precision. She had less than 2 months before her birthday. If she lost the voting rights, Marcus would control the company, and every clean project she had built, every ethical standard she had fought to establish, would be dismantled and sold for parts. She did not fear losing money. She feared losing the only thing she had created with her own hands. The only proof she was more than her father's cold dynasty. Marrying someone from her social circle was impossible. Her opponents would investigate the connection, prove the marriage was a legal maneuver, and sue to invoke the trust clause. She needed a marriage that was technically legitimate, but impossible to connect to corporate gain. She needed someone with no shares, no political ties, and a work history that proved he had nothing to gain from her world. Derek Callahan's name surfaced in her mind like a lifeline made of thorns. A man outside her system with a clean employment record and a life that had no intersection with corporate power. He was mature enough to sign papers immediately. He was also a father, which made him vulnerable to an offer involving his daughter's future. Victoria knew dragging him into this trap was selfish, possibly cruel. She did it anyway because she was out of time and out of options. The next morning, Derek received an emergency call about another electrical malfunction at the county building. He took the job because the payment would cover this semester's school expenses for Isla. He had promised his daughter he would be home by 4 to help her make construction paper snowflakes for the holiday display. That promise sat in his chest like an anchor as he drove through the gray winter streets. Victoria arrived at the building before Derek finished the diagnostic check. She walked straight to where he stood testing voltage, her face rigid and her hands trembling in a way she thought she had hidden. She did not greet him or explain. She simply said 2 words, "Follow me." Derek assumed she was an official who needed urgent repairs. He followed her down the hallway toward what he thought was another electrical panel. She led him into the marriage registry office instead. A clerk sat ready at the desk with paperwork already half prepared. All it needed was the groom's signature. Derek understood in the span of a heartbeat and jerked his hand away. He told her plainly that he was not a toy for rich people to manipulate. Victoria's voice cracked when she spoke next, a hairline fracture in the ice. She was not asking. She was demanding, but the demand held terror underneath. She offered him a straightforward transaction, a 5-minute marriage, then an annulment, then payment large enough to secure his daughter's future. Derek refused because his self-respect was not for sale. Victoria shifted tactics with the ruthlessness of someone who had run out of moves. She stopped talking about money for him. She talked about money for Isla instead. Tuition, health care, a stable future. Derek felt something twist in his chest. He hated being bought, but he was also a father who could not pretend his daughter's opportunities meant nothing. He set his own conditions in a voice harder than any she had heard in a boardroom. Everything in writing. No mandatory cohabitation, no invasion of their privacy, no media exposure for his daughter. If this marriage harmed Isla in any way, he would leave immediately and pursue legal action. Victoria agreed without hesitation, as if the signature was the only thing that mattered and everything else was negotiable. The clerk pushed the papers forward. The questions were standard procedural, almost boring in their routine nature. Derek answered mechanically, his mind unable to catch up with what his hand was doing. Victoria signed fast, her hand steady even though her eyes would not meet his for more than a second. The official seal pressed into the document and they became husband and wife in the eyes of the law. 5 minutes from start to finish. Derek felt like he had walked into a room with no exit. Victoria felt like she had survived, but the cost was written in the rigid set of a stranger's shoulders, a man who now carried a burden he had never asked for. Within hours, someone leaked the marriage to the media. An anonymous account posted that the chief executive had secretly wed an unknown man with no public profile. Marcus Thornton did not suppress the story. He amplified it, letting gossip and speculation spread like infection through financial news sites and social platforms. Reginald Kemp planted suggestions in strategic ears hinting that the marriage was a desperate legal maneuver to retain control. Derek's apartment building filled with curious neighbors and strangers with cameras. His landlord raised the rent, citing increased interest in the property. Derek felt his privacy shredding like paper in wind, but his real fear was not for himself. It was for Isla. At school, another parent made a loud comment within Isla's hearing. Her father had climbed the ladder by marrying someone rich, taking shortcuts regular people could not afford. Isla did not fully understand the words, but she understood shame. That night, she asked her father the 3 questions, and her voice was smaller than usual. "Did you do something wrong, Dad?" Derek felt his throat close. He realized that 5 minutes had started to destroy his daughter's sense of safety. Victoria tried to manage the crisis like a corporate problem. She deployed lawyers to suppress media coverage and offered to transfer Isla to an expensive private school where her name would not draw attention. Derek's response came sharp and immediate. His daughter was not a problem to be purchased and relocated. She was a child who deserved respect and normalcy, not isolation in a gilded box. The legal team delivered worse news. To defend the marriage's legitimacy before the board's investigation, Victoria and Derek needed to demonstrate basic elements of a shared household. They had to establish a common residence in official records. Without it, Marcus could argue the marriage was purely ceremonial, trigger the trust clause, and seize the voting rights. Victoria asked Derek to move into her house. Not really, she clarified. Just on paper, just to pass scrutiny. Derek agreed reluctantly because Isla was already suffering from media attention and he wanted his daughter somewhere more secure. He told himself it was temporary, a legal formality that would end soon. But then Vivian Ashford arrived at Derek's apartment with documents that shattered what remained of the 5-minute illusion. She was a corporate attorney who had worked on the trust fund details, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts who had stayed neutral through Marcus's maneuvering because the law was the law. Now she sat across from Derek at his small kitchen table and explained what Victoria had not. The trust fund did not just require marriage before age 35. It required a marriage duration of at least 6 months to be recognized as legitimate family stability. Any dissolution before that minimum period would activate the clause as if the marriage had never happened. The document spelled it out in language so precise there could be no misunderstanding. Derek found the legal memo himself later that evening, left on a desk in Victoria's office where he had gone to retrieve documents she had promised to share. The paper outlined marriage duration requirements in black and white. 6 months minimum, not 5 minutes, not a quick annulment. He confronted Victoria with the paper in his hand and anger in his voice. She had lured him into signing under false pretenses, trapping him in a legal cage that was never supposed to be just 5 minutes. Victoria responded with her usual defenses, cold deflection and strategic silence. Derek slammed his hand on the table, not with violence, but with the force of frustration breaking through. Her power was crushing his daughter's life, he said. And his voice shook when he spoke. Isla heard them arguing from her room and retreated into frightened silence. Later, Derek found her journal lying open, and the words on the page stopped his heart. When was Dad saddest today? When was Miss Victoria saddest today? His daughter had started including Victoria in the 3 questions, treating this stranger like family. Derek felt something break inside his chest. Isla was getting attached to a situation that could end any moment, and the lie about duration had turned a desperate gamble into something far more dangerous. Victoria finally admitted the deeper truth, though her admission came wrapped in defensive layers she could not quite shed. She did not fear losing her position or her wealth. She feared Marcus dismantling the projects that mattered to her. The educational funding for underserved communities, the data privacy protections she had fought to implement, the ethical standards she had built to atone for her family's ruthless past. If she lost control, everything she had tried to repair would be suddenly destroyed. Her voice dropped to a whisper when she said it. She was not fighting for a chair. She was fighting to keep the only good things she had ever created from being erased. Derek felt his anger shift into something more complicated. He still resented being used as a tool, but he also saw her being hunted like prey, cornered by people who used law and power the way other predators use teeth. He set new terms. From now on, total transparency. Every legal document, every strategic move had to be shared with him, and Victoria had to personally guarantee Isla's protection from media intrusion and board manipulation. Victoria agreed, but this time her agreement felt less like a command and more like a request for a second chance. The house was a mansion that felt more like a museum. Long hallways stretched in perfect symmetry. White light poured from fixtures designed for elegance rather than comfort, and polished marble surfaces reflected everything back in cold precision. Silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the distant hum of climate control systems maintaining perfect temperature. Staff members looked at Derek like he was trespassing in a space that did not belong to him, their eyes measuring him and finding him wanting. He brought Isla inside, guiding her gently by the shoulder, and his daughter went quiet, clutching her backpack as if afraid to touch anything. Her sneakers squeaked softly on the marble floor, each sound echoing in the cavernous space. Victoria watched them standing in her foyer, looking lost. Small figures swallowed by architecture meant to impress rather than welcome. For the first time, she saw her home through different eyes. It looked frightening. It looked like a place where warmth came to die. Marcus Thornton moved forward with his legal assault. The board announced an ethics review of the chief executive's conduct, framing it as a question of governance, stability, and shareholder confidence. The real goal was forcing Victoria to prove her marriage was genuine, and if she could not prove it, they would invoke the trust clause and strip her voting power. Reginald Kemp hired investigators to dig into Derek's background, searching for debt, legal violations, anything that could paint him as an opportunist exploiting a desperate woman. The first days of cohabitation felt like two strangers occupying the same cold museum. Victoria established rules: do not enter my private workspace, do not touch personal files, do not disrupt the household schedule. Derek set his own boundaries. Isla would live like a normal child with regular meals, consistent bedtime, and no use as a publicity tool. He told Victoria that his daughter was not a prop for corporate theater. Victoria had spent her life issuing orders and watching people obey. Derek did not obey, but he also did not argue. He simply did things his own way, maintaining standards that had nothing to do with money or status. When staff members treated him dismissively, he responded with competence, doing his work so well they could not find fault. Victoria observed this with something close to fascination. This man possessed something she had lost years ago: the ability to remain calm without needing to prove his worth. Isla began making small changes to the house. She drew a Christmas picture and taped it to the refrigerator. Victoria stared at the bright crayon marks on her stainless steel appliance, unable to remember the last time anything handmade had existed in this space. Isla asked her one evening if she liked cookies. Victoria said no, automatically a reflex response. That night, she quietly instructed the kitchen staff to bake cookies anyway. She could not explain why. Late one night, exhaustion and pressure finally cracked Victoria's composure. She sat alone in a dark room with her head in her hands. Makeup stripped away, fingers trembling slightly. Derek found her there by accident. He did not offer empty reassurances or try to fix what he did not understand. He brought her a glass of warm water and said simply that she needed to sleep or she would lose tomorrow's battle. Victoria looked up at him. This man she had dragged into her war and realized something fundamental had shifted. Someone had just cared for her in the most practical, unglamorous way possible without expecting anything in return. The gesture was so small it should have meant nothing, but it landed in her chest with the weight of something she had forgotten existed. Derek quietly changed the lighting in the hallways, replacing harsh white bulbs with warmer tones so Isla could sleep better. Victoria walked through the softer light one evening and felt her house shift into something closer to a home. She reminded herself this was temporary, a contract with an expiration date. Then she watched Derek teach Isla how to check if an electrical outlet was working properly. His patience infinite as her small hands fumbled with the testing tool, and Victoria felt the expiration date blur into something less certain. The investigators Marcus hired released their findings through a financial blog that published an article describing Derek's past debt and insinuating he had married for money. The truth was mundane and painful. The debt came from Sarah's final hospital bills, medical expenses. Derek had slowly paid down over years, but the article twisted the facts into a narrative of opportunism and instability. Worse photographers captured images of Isla at school, her face confused and frightened. Derek reached his breaking point. This was the line that could not be crossed. But something else emerged in the research. Victoria's legal team uncovered records showing Derek had once worked as a senior electrical systems technician for a major infrastructure company. He had been excellent at his job until he reported safety violations in a project cutting costs by using substandard wiring. The report led to a worksite accident being prevented, but it also led to Derek being forced out of the industry through blacklisting and pressure. He had lost his career because he refused to stay silent about something dangerous. Victoria understood then. Derek was not poor because he lacked skill or ambition. He was poor because he had paid the price for doing the right thing when no one with power wanted to hear it. He was like her in a way she had not expected, someone fighting against a system designed to crush integrity. Word count 3847. Target 6-807,000. Continuing. Derek's former colleague Cole Brennan reached out after seeing the news coverage. Cole ran a small electrical contracting business, now having also been pushed out of the corporate infrastructure world for supporting Derek's safety report. He called Derek's cell phone on a Tuesday evening while Isla was doing homework at the kitchen table in Victoria's mansion. "Saw your name all over the financial sites. Figured you might need someone who remembers what actually happened at Meridian." Derek stepped into the hallway, keeping his voice low. Cole had been the only person willing to back his report, the only witness who confirmed the substandard wiring specifications. For that loyalty, Cole had lost his promotion, then his position, then his industry reputation. "I'm handling it. You're getting dragged through the same mud they used on us 5 years ago. Different players, same playbook." Cole's voice carried the rough edges of someone who had learned not to trust corporate promises. "If you need testimony about why you lost that job, I'll give it. On record. These people don't get to rewrite history twice." Derek felt something loosen in his chest, the isolation of the past weeks cracking open just enough to let in the reminder that he had not always fought alone. He told Cole he would keep the offer in mind, knowing that accepting it would pull his friend back into a battle Cole had already lost once. After hanging up, Derek found Victoria in her home office, reviewing legal briefs. She glanced up when he entered, her reading glasses perched on her nose in a way that made her look less like a corporate titan and more like someone trying to find answers in documents that refused to cooperate. "That was Cole Brennan. He worked with me at Meridian Infrastructure." Derek leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "He's offering to testify about the safety violations that got me fired. Wants to go on record about what actually happened." Victoria set down the brief. The investigators will use him to reinforce their narrative. They'll say you're coordinating with allies to manufacture credibility. Or they'll realize I was right then and I'm not lying now. Derek's jaw tightened. Cole lost as much as I did, more maybe. He had a wife and 2 kids depending on that salary. Then why would he risk exposing himself again? Because some people still believe doing the right thing matters even when it costs them everything. The words hung between them, sharp enough to draw blood. Victoria looked away first, her fingers drumming once against the desk before going still. She was learning slowly and painfully that the armor she wore had been built from the same materials Marcus and Reginald used for their weapons. Control. Calculation. The belief that power justified any means. Derek was showing her a different foundation, one that did not rely on manipulation or strategic advantage. He simply refused to compromise on what he knew was right, even when the cost was brutal. Even when it meant losing the career he had built, the financial security his family needed, the future he had planned. Victoria had spent 3 weeks watching him maintain that standard in her house with her staff, with Isla. He did not bend to make things easier. He did not perform integrity for an audience. He just lived it quietly and without fanfare, as if there was no other option worth considering. "Tell Cole I appreciate the offer," Victoria said finally. "But let's hold it in reserve. If we use him too early, Marcus will have time to discredit him before the board hearing. We need to be strategic about when we reveal our evidence." Derek nodded, recognizing the shift. She was not dismissing Cole's value or questioning Derek's judgment. She was thinking tactically about how to protect someone who had already been hurt by the same forces now targeting them. It was a small thing, barely worth noting, but Derek noticed it anyway. Isla appeared in the doorway, her homework folder tucked under one arm. She looked at Derek, then at Victoria, her young face serious in a way that made Derek's chest ache. His daughter had learned to read tension the way some children learn to read weather, a survival skill developed from years of watching her father navigate a world that kept taking things away. "Is everything okay?" Derek crouched to her level. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just grown-up stuff about work." Miss Victoria looked sad. Isla's observation landed with the precision of a child who noticed what adults tried to hide. "Is it because of the mean people Dad told me about?" Victoria's expression flickered surprise crossing her face before she smoothed it away, but not quickly enough. Isla had seen it, and Derek had seen Isla see it. His daughter was connecting the dots, building a map of the adults around her and their unspoken struggles. "The mean people are just confused," Victoria said, her voice gentler than Derek had heard it before. "They think I'm not good at my job, but they're wrong. Your dad is helping me prove it. Dad's really good at fixing things." Isla's certainty was absolute, the kind of faith that came from watching someone show up every day and do what they promised. "He'll fix this too." Derek felt the weight of that trust settle across his shoulders, familiar and heavy. He had built his entire life around being someone Isla could count on, someone who kept promises even when keeping them was hard. Now he was tangled in a situation where keeping those promises meant staying in a marriage built on lies, in a house that felt like a cage with a woman who had bought his cooperation through his daughter's future. But Isla was looking at Victoria with something that was not quite trust yet, but might become it given time. And Victoria was looking back at his daughter with an expression Derek could not quite name, something sicker than calculation, and more uncertain than control. Later that night, after Isla had gone to bed with her 3 questions answered, Derek found Victoria still in her office. The legal briefs had multiplied, spreading across her desk in organized chaos. She was making notes in the margins with a fountain pen, her handwriting precise and angular. "She's getting attached to you." Derek did not sit down, keeping the conversation vertical and direct. "Isla, she's including you in her world. I noticed." Victoria did not look up from her notes. Is that a problem? It's a complication. When this ends, when the 6 months are up and we go our separate ways, she's going to ask questions I don't know how to answer. Now Victoria did look up, setting the pen down with careful deliberation. What if it doesn't end? The question landed like a stone in still water ripples, spreading out in directions Derek was not prepared to map. He stared at her, searching for the angle, the strategic play hidden beneath the words. But Victoria's face showed something he had not seen before, genuine uncertainty. She was asking, not maneuvering. We made a deal, 6 months to satisfy the trust fund, then we're done. Deals can be renegotiated. Victoria stood, walking to the window that overlooked the dark grounds of her estate. I'm not saying I want that. I'm saying it's a possibility we should consider. Isla is adjusting better here than either of us expected. The school situation will be resolved once we transfer her. And you, she paused, her reflection ghostly in the glass. You're the first person in 10 years who's told me the truth even when it hurt. Derek felt something dangerous unfold in his chest, a hope he had not given himself permission to feel. He crushed it immediately, ruthlessly, because hope had a way of turning into disappointment, and disappointment was something Isla could not afford. I'm here because you backed me into a corner. Let's not pretend this is anything more than a transaction. Is that what it is? Victoria turned to face him, and for once her armor had cracks wide enough to see through. Because from where I'm standing, it stopped being just a transaction the moment you started teaching my kitchen staff how to make pancakes that don't taste like cardboard. The moment you fixed the thermostat so the house isn't cold enough to preserve meat. The moment you sat with me at midnight and handed me water instead of judgment. Derek wanted to argue, to maintain the clear lines that kept this situation manageable. But the truth was messier than he wanted to admit. He had started noticing things about Victoria that did not fit the Ice Queen narrative. The way she checked on Isla's homework without being asked. The way she had quietly replaced the harsh overhead lights in Isla's bedroom with softer lamps. The way she listened when he talked about the board's investigation, not just as a problem to solve, but as something that genuinely troubled her. 6 months, he said finally, because it was the only safe answer. We get through 6 months, we prove the marriage is legitimate, and then we figure out what comes next. No promises, no expectations. Victoria nodded, accepting the boundary, even as her eyes held questions she did not voice. Derek left her office and climbed the stairs to the guest room that had become his temporary sanctuary, a space that was not quite his, but no longer entirely foreign. Isla's door was cracked open, her nightlight casting soft shadows across the hallway. Derek paused, listening to his daughter's breathing, the steady rhythm of sleep, undisturbed by the complications the adults had created. He had promised to protect her. Everything else was secondary to that promise. The board's ethics investigation accelerated over the following week. Marcus Thornton convened a special committee to review Victoria's fitness for continued leadership, a phrase that sounded neutral but carried the weight of a guillotine. Reginald Kemp produced a detailed analysis of the company's performance under Victoria's tenure, cherry-picking metrics that showed volatility while ignoring the long-term growth and ethical improvements she had implemented. Vivian Ashford attended the preliminary hearings as required by her role as corporate counsel. But she began leaving documents on Victoria's desk when no one was watching. Financial reports that contradicted Reginald's analysis. Board meeting minutes that showed Marcus had discussed removing Victoria months before the trust fund clause became relevant. Evidence of premeditation. Derek spent his days working on electrical contracts around the city, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, while his evenings were consumed by strategy sessions with Victoria and Vivian. The three of them would sit in Victoria's office, reviewing documents, building timelines, identifying the gaps in Marcus's attack. During one of these sessions, Derek noticed something in an old building permit application for Hayes Global's headquarters. The electrical contractor listed was Meridian Infrastructure, the same company that had fired him. The permit was dated 6 years ago, right around the time Derek had filed his safety report. He pulled up the project specifications and felt his stomach turn. The wiring installation described in the permit used the same substandard materials Derek had flagged in his report. The same corner cutting that had nearly caused a catastrophic failure in another building. And the project manager listed on the permit was someone Derek recognized, a Meridian executive who had personally overseen Derek's termination. Hayes Global used Meridian for your headquarters renovation. Derek looked up at Victoria, the document still glowing on the laptop screen. 6 years ago, yes. Before I became CEO, my father approved that contract. The wiring they installed is the same substandard material I reported. The same stuff that almost killed people. Derek's hands clenched into fists. If that wiring is still in this building, you're sitting on a fire hazard that could evacuate the entire structure. Victoria went very still, the kind of stillness that came before storms. Reginald Kemp was CFO then. He would have approved the budget for that renovation. Vivian leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the permit. If Kemp knew about substandard materials and approved them anyway, that's corporate negligence. If anyone got hurt, he'd be personally liable. No one got hurt because the installation was in administrative areas, not high-traffic zones. Derek pulled up more documents, his electrician's training allowing him to read the technical specifications faster than the lawyers could process them. But it's still a violation of building codes, still dangerous, and still grounds for an investigation if anyone bothered to look. Victoria's expression shifted from shock to something harder, more calculating. Marcus and Reginald are investigating my fitness for leadership while sitting on a building code violation that could shut down our headquarters. The hypocrisy is almost impressive. It's more than hypocrisy, Vivian said quietly. It's leverage. Derek understood what she meant. They could expose the wiring issue, force a building inspection, and reveal that Reginald had approved materials that violated safety standards. It would shift the ethics investigation from Victoria's personal life to the board's own negligence. But it would also mean Derek had to go on record about Meridian again, had to relive the professional destruction that had nearly broken him the first time. I'll do it, he said before he could talk himself out of it. I'll file the report. My name's already mud in the industry, so I've got nothing left to lose. You have Isla. Victoria's voice cut through his resolve. If you file this report, Reginald will come after you with everything he has. He'll paint you as a disgruntled employee with a vendetta, someone who makes up safety violations to hurt companies that fire him. It will be worse than what happened at Meridian. Then we make sure the evidence is airtight. Derek met her eyes across the desk. We get building inspectors involved before we go public. We document everything, and we do it right because that's the only way it means anything. Vivian nodded slowly, her lawyer's mind already mapping the strategy. But Victoria stayed silent, her gaze locked on Derek with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She was seeing something, calculating something, and he was not sure if he should be worried or relieved. I'll arrange for an independent building inspection, Victoria said finally. Anonymous tip to the fire marshal about concerns regarding electrical compliance. Once they find the violations, it becomes their investigation, not ours. Derek stays out of it until we need his technical testimony. It was a good plan, a careful plan, and Derek recognized it as the kind of strategic thinking that had made Victoria successful. But he also recognized something else: she was protecting him. Not because it served her interests, but because she genuinely did not want to see him hurt again. The realization settled into his bones with uncomfortable weight. This was not supposed to happen. He was not supposed to start seeing Victoria Sinclair as someone worth protecting in return. He was supposed to survive 6 months, take the compensation she had promised, and rebuild his life with Isla somewhere ruined from corporate intrigue and manufactured crises. But somewhere between the courthouse and the mansion, between the arguments and the late-night strategy sessions, between watching her fumble through making hot chocolate for Isla and seeing her stand up to board members who treated her like a problem to be managed, Derek had started to see a person instead of a transaction, and that person was fighting for something that mattered even if her methods had started out wrong. The fire marshal's inspection happened on a Thursday morning, unannounced and thorough. Derek was not present, but Victoria called him afterward, her voice tight with satisfaction. They found 14 code violations in the administrative wing. The wiring is exactly what you said it was, substandard materials installed in violation of specifications. They're requiring immediate remediation and issuing citations to the building owner. Which is Hayes Global. With Reginald Kemp as the CFO, who approved the original contract and budget. Victoria's satisfaction was almost audible. Marcus wanted an ethics investigation. Now he has one, but it's pointed at his lieutenant instead of me. Derek should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from winning battles that should never have needed fighting. But he recognized this for what it was, a turning point. Marcus and Reginald had spent weeks building a case against Victoria, and now their own negligence was about to become public record. What happens next? Vivian files a motion to expand the ethics investigation to include the building code violations. We present evidence that Reginald approved contracts with materials he knew were substandard, and we ask the board whether they want to continue questioning my fitness for leadership while ignoring actual corporate negligence in their own ranks. It was elegant in its simplicity, a strategic reversal that used the enemy's weapon against them. Derek found himself almost admiring Victoria's ability to turn disaster into advantage, even as part of him mourned the necessity of it. That night, Isla asked her 3 questions, and Derek answered with more honesty than he had managed in weeks. What made you happiest today? Seeing someone I care about win a fight she deserved to win. Isla's eyes widened slightly, recognizing that her father's happiness was connected to someone other than her. She looked toward Victoria's office door, visible from where they sat in the kitchen, and something understanding crossed her young face. What made you saddest today? Knowing that winning this fight means more fights are coming. What do you want to change tomorrow? Derek paused, meeting his daughter's gaze and seeing his late wife's wisdom looking back at him. I want to stop being afraid of what happens when 6 months is over. Isla smiled, small and knowing. She leaned against his shoulder, her homework forgotten, and Derek realized his daughter had already figured out what he was still trying to deny. The building code violations became public 3 days after the fire marshal's inspection, splashed across industry publications and picked up by financial media looking for ammunition against Victoria. Marcus Thornton tried to spin the story as evidence of poor oversight during her tenure, but Vivian Ashford had prepared documentation showing the contracts were signed and approved 2 years before Victoria became chief executive. Reginald Kemp's signature appeared on every budget authorization, every material specification, every contractor approval. The narrative Marcus had carefully constructed began to crack. Board members who had aligned with him started asking uncomfortable questions about why the CFO had approved substandard materials for a headquarters renovation. The ethics investigation that was supposed to destroy Victoria's legitimacy now threatened to expose the very people who had orchestrated it. Derek watched this unfold from the margins, his role invisible to everyone except the 3 people who knew the truth. He continued taking electrical contracts during the day, maintaining the fiction that he was simply Victoria Sinclair's unexpected husband. trying to preserve some independence. But his evenings were spent in strategy sessions that felt increasingly like war councils, mapping out Marcus's vulnerabilities and planning countermoves that would require precision timing. Victoria changed in ways Derek noticed before she seemed aware of them herself. She started pausing before making decisions, asking questions instead of issuing verdicts. During a meeting with her executive team about quarterly projections, she stopped mid-sentence to ask Derek what he thought about a proposed infrastructure upgrade. The executive stared at her like she had started speaking a foreign language. Victoria Sinclair did not consult, she decided. But she was consulting now, and Derek found himself explaining load-bearing calculations and redundancy systems to people who earned 10 times his annual income. The executives listened because Victoria made it clear they would. But Derek saw something shift in their expressions when he described how the proposed upgrade would create single points of failure that could cascade into total system collapse. This was not theoretical corporate strategy. This was practical knowledge earned through years of troubleshooting failures that others had created through shortcuts and assumptions. One executive, a woman named Sarah Chen, who oversaw facilities management, stayed after the meeting to ask Derek for his assessment of their current electrical infrastructure. Victoria watched this exchange with an expression Derek could not quite interpret, something between satisfaction and surprise, as if she was discovering that respect could be earned through competence, rather than demanded through position. Isla adjusted to the mansion in ways that reminded Derek his daughter was more resilient than his protective instincts wanted to admit. She befriended Thomas, the head chef, who taught her how to measure ingredients and explained the chemistry of baking in terms simple enough for a 7-year-old to grasp. She charmed Margaret, the head of household staff, by asking detailed questions about how the cleaning systems worked and offering to help organize the supply closets. The child, who had been terrified of touching anything in the vast marble spaces, now navigated them with increasing confidence. She left her drawings on surfaces Victoria had previously kept pristine. She asked permission to rearrange furniture in her room so she could see the garden from her bed. She slowly, methodically transformed sterile spaces into places where a child could live. Victoria noticed. Derek saw her pause in doorways, observing Isla's casual ownership of rooms that had never held the warmth of actual habitation. He watched Victoria's face as she processed this transformation, recognizing that his daughter was doing something Victoria herself had never managed, turning the mansion into a home. But the outside pressure continued to mount. Investigators hired by Reginald produced a second report, this one focused on Derek's employment history. They had interviewed former colleagues at Meridian Infrastructure, collecting statements from people who remembered Derek as difficult, inflexible, someone who created problems where none existed. The safety violations he had reported were reframed as misunderstandings. His insistence on proper materials characterized as unrealistic perfectionism that ignored budget constraints and project timelines. The report never mentioned that Derek had been proven right when an independent review confirmed the wiring specifications violated building codes. It never acknowledged that his recommendations had prevented a potential catastrophe in a residential complex where families lived. It simply painted a picture of a man who could not hold a job, could not work within corporate systems, and had a pattern of blaming others for his failures. Cole Brennan called again after the report went public, his anger barely contained through the phone line. Derek stood in the mansion's library, staring out at grounds dusted with fresh snow, while Cole described how the investigators had contacted him, asking leading questions designed to extract quotes that would support their narrative. They wanted me to say you were paranoid about the wiring, that you saw problems that weren't there because you needed someone to blame for your career stalling out. Cole's voice carried the rough edge of a man who had learned not to trust polished questions. I told them to go to hell, but they're not going to put that in their report. Derek pressed his forehead against the cold glass, feeling the weight of repetition settle across his shoulders. He had fought this battle before and lost. The truth had not mattered then because the people with power had decided it was inconvenient. Now he was fighting the same battle with different enemies, and the outcome felt depressingly predictable. I appreciate you backing me up. I'm not backing you up, I'm telling the truth. Cole's distinction was sharp and deliberate. There's a difference. One's about loyalty, the other's about what actually happened. You were right about Meridian and you know it. Don't let these corporate predators rewrite history just because they've got better lawyers. After the call ended, Derek found Victoria in the dining room reviewing documents with Vivian. They had spread papers across the table's polished surface, building timelines and cross-referencing financial records. Derek recognized the intensity in their posture, the way they leaned into the work with the focus of people hunting for something specific. The investigators are good, he said without preamble. They found people at Meridian willing to trash my reputation and made it sound credible. Vivian looked up, her sharp eyes assessing him with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating evidence. We expected that. Character assassination is cheaper than admitting negligence. It's still going to play well with the board. Marcus gets to present me as the opportunist with a history of blaming employers when things go wrong. Derek moved to the table, scanning the documents they had assembled. What are you looking for? Victoria sat back, removing her reading glasses in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. Connections between Marcus and Reginald that go back further than Hayes Global. If they've worked together before, if there's a pattern of this kind of manipulation, it gives us leverage. You want to prove this is not just about you. It's about them having a system. Derek understood the strategy, even as part of him recoiled from the necessary cynicism of it. Show the board that what they're doing to you, they've done to others. Exactly. Vivian shuffled papers, pulling out a set of corporate filings from a company Derek did not recognize. Reginald worked as CFO for 3 other companies before Hayes Global. 2 of them experienced sudden CEO changes within months of his arrival. Both times the outgoing CEO was a woman. Both times the board cited concerns about leadership stability and personal conduct. The pattern was too clear to be coincidence. Derek felt something cold settle in his stomach, recognizing that Victoria's situation was not unique. It was a playbook refined through repetition and successful enough that Marcus and Reginald had decided to run it again. Can you prove Marcus was involved in those other changes? Working on it. But even if we can't, the pattern alone raises questions the board will have to address. Victoria's expression held a grim satisfaction. They wanted an ethics investigation. We're going to give them one that covers more than my marriage. The charity gala happened on a Saturday evening, a winter fundraiser for educational programs that Victoria had sponsored for 3 years. She had tried to cancel her attendance, but Vivian advised against it. Absence would be interpreted as weakness, as evidence that Victoria could not withstand scrutiny. So they went Derek in a borrowed suit that fit poorly across the shoulders, Victoria in a midnight blue dress that cost more than Derek's first car. The ballroom filled with people whose casual conversations involved mergers and acquisitions, whose charitable donations were tax strategies, whose smiles carried calculations Derek could see but not fully decipher. He hated the performance of it, the way every interaction felt like a transaction disguised as pleasantry. But Isla was at home with Margaret, safe and occupied with a craft project, and Derek had promised his daughter he would do what needed doing. Marcus found them during the cocktail reception, his approach choreographed to seem casual while ensuring they were surrounded by witnesses. He had brought 2 other board members with him, strategic reinforcements who smiled with practiced neutrality. Victoria, I'm glad you decided to attend despite the current difficulties. Marcus's voice carried the false warmth of someone performing concern for an audience. And Derek, of course. How are you finding married life? Derek felt Victoria's posture shift beside him, her spine straightening in preparation for attack or defense. He stepped slightly forward, creating a physical barrier between her and Marcus that was subtle enough to seem accidental. It's an adjustment, but most worthwhile things are. Indeed, Marcus's smile did not reach his eyes. I imagine the lifestyle change has been considerable, from a small apartment to Victoria's estate, from struggling to make rent to having access to resources most people can't imagine. The implication hung in the air, poisonous and deliberate. Derek was a gold digger, an opportunist, someone who had seen Victoria's wealth and decided to exploit her desperation. The board members watched with the predatory interest of people who sensed weakness being exposed. The biggest adjustment has been learning that wealth doesn't solve the problems that actually matter. Derek met Marcus's gaze without flinching. Resources can't buy integrity. Money can't manufacture character. And all the power in the world won't help you sleep at night if you're building empires on other people's suffering. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive orthodontics, frowned slightly. Derek had just insulted Marcus without saying his name, and everyone in the conversation understood it. Marcus's smile went rigid. Interesting philosophy for someone who married into considerable financial advantage. I married someone who needed help standing against people who were trying to destroy her for wanting to do business ethically. Derek kept his voice level, conversational, as if they were discussing weather instead of warfare. The financial advantage was never the point. Doing what's right when it's hard, that's the point. Victoria's hand found his, her fingers sliding between his in a gesture that could have been affection, but felt more like solidarity. Derek felt the slight tremor in her grip, recognizing that she was fighting her own battle with the exposure of standing here being judged by people who had already decided she was guilty. We met because I was fixing electrical systems that more expensive contractors had installed incorrectly. Derek continued, keeping his focus on Marcus. I told Victoria I'd do the job right instead of fast, and she listened. That's when I knew she was different from most people with power. She actually cared about doing things correctly even when it was inconvenient. Marcus's expression darkened. He had expected defensiveness apologies, some acknowledgement of the power imbalance. Instead, Derek was reframing the entire narrative, suggesting that Victoria's willingness to listen to a working electrician was evidence of her fitness for leadership rather than evidence of desperation. How charming. Marcus's tone had lost its false warmth. I'm sure the board will be interested in hearing more about your relationship at the formal hearing next week. The threat was clear. Derek had just painted a target on himself for the board's investigation, but he had also shifted the ground of the battle, making it about competence and ethics instead of about wealth and opportunism. After Marcus departed with his board members in tow, Victoria released Derek's hand and turned to face him. Her eyes held questions she did not voice aloud. Not here, where anyone might be listening. You just made yourself the primary target. Good. Let them focus on me instead of you. Derek glanced around the ballroom, noting the curious stares and whispered conversations their exchange with Marcus had triggered. Besides, I'm better equipped to handle an attack on my character than you are to handle an attack on your position. I've already lost everything they can take from me. You haven't. It was not entirely true. Derek still had Isla. Still had his freedom, still had the small measure of dignity he had rebuilt after Meridian destroyed his career. But the statement carried enough truth to land, and Victoria heard it. We should leave. Her voice was quieter than Derek had heard it all evening. We've made the appearance. Staying longer just gives them more ammunition. They left through a side exit, avoiding the main entrance where photographers waited for shots of arriving guests. The car ride back to the mansion passed in slunts, both of them processing what had just happened and what it meant for the battle ahead. Isla was asleep when they arrived home. Her latest art project spread across the kitchen table in cheerful chaos. Derek checked on her as he did every night, adjusting her blankets and watching the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing. His daughter's world was smaller than the corporate intrigue consuming the adults around her, but it was also clearer. Isla knew who she could trust because people either showed up or they did not. They either kept promises or broke them. Derek envied that clarity even as he worked to preserve it. Victoria was waiting in the library when he came downstairs, 2 glasses of wine poured, though Derek suspected neither of them would drink much. She stood by the window looking out at grounds lit by security lights, her posture holding the exhaustion of someone who had been performing strength for too long. "Thank you for what you did tonight." Derek accepted the wine glass, but did not sit. "I told them the truth. That's all. You made me sound like someone worth defending instead of someone who bought her way out of a problem." Victoria turned from the window, meeting his eyes with a directness that still caught him off guard. "I've spent 3 weeks watching you refuse to compromise on what you believe is right, even when it costs you, even when easier options exist. I didn't understand that at first. I thought it was stubborn pride. And now I think it's the only thing worth having." She set her wine glass down untouched. "Marcus and Reginald will keep attacking because that's what they do. They'll twist facts and manufacture narratives and use every resource they have to make us look like criminals. But they can't make their version true just by saying it loudly enough. Not if we refuse to let them rewrite reality." Derek recognized what she was offering, even if she had not fully articulated it yet. An alliance built on something more than transaction. A partnership where the goal was not just survival, but actually doing what was right even when the cost was brutal. "The board hearing is in 10 days. Derek finally sat the wine glass warming in his hands. "We need to decide how we're going to handle the electrical surge evidence." They had been dancing around this question for days. Derek's discovery about the power surge during their first meeting, the one that had disabled security systems and allowed someone to access sealed trust fund documents, was powerful evidence of premeditation. But using it meant Derek would have to testify about his technical expertise, would have to withstand. Cross-examination about his history with Meridian would have to defend his credibility against investigators who had already painted him as someone who invented problems. Vivian had suggested bringing in an independent electrical engineer to validate Derek's analysis, but Derek knew that would undercut the impact. The power of his testimony was not just the technical accuracy. It was that he had been there, had seen the failure in real time, could describe exactly what kind of deliberate action would create that specific pattern of outages. "I think you should present it yourself." Victoria's voice held the certainty of someone who had made a decision and committed to it fully. "Not because we don't have other options, but because your testimony will carry weight that hired experts can't match. You were there. You saw what happened, and you have the expertise to explain why it matters." "Marcus will destroy my credibility before I finish the first sentence. Let him try." Victoria leaned forward, her intensity focused entirely on Derek. "I've spent 3 weeks watching you fix things that expensive contractors left broken. I've seen you explain complex systems in ways that anyone can understand. I've listened to you answer Isla's questions with patience that never wavers. You have a gift for making complicated things clear, and that's exactly what we need in that hearing room." Derek wanted to believe her, but years of having his expertise dismissed had left scars that did not heal easily. At Meridian, they had called him alarmist, inflexible, someone who could not understand the realities of budget constraints and project timelines. The investigators Reginald hired had used the same language, the same dismissive framing that suggested Derek's concerns were problems of personality rather than legitimate technical issues. What if I'm not enough? The question came out smaller than Derek intended, exposing vulnerability he usually kept locked away. But Victoria did not flinch from it. Then we lose. But we lose having told the truth instead of letting them win through lies. She reached across the space between them, her hand covering his in a gesture that had nothing to do with performance or strategy. I dragged you into this because I was desperate and selfish. The least I can do is make sure we fight it the right way. Not because it's strategically optimal, but because it's what people with integrity do when they're backed into corners. Derek felt something fundamental shift in his chest. A realization that this woman he had met under the worst possible circumstances had somehow become someone he genuinely respected. Not because of her wealth or position, but because she was learning to value the things that actually mattered. Learning to ask instead of demand. Learning that power meant nothing if it was built on corruption. The school situation resolved itself through a combination of Victoria's connections and Isla's resilience. A small private school in a neighboring district agreed to accept a mid-year transfer, their headmistress more interested in Isla's test scores and teacher recommendations than in the media coverage surrounding her father's marriage. The school emphasized creative learning and community values, the kind of environment where Isla's natural curiosity would be nurtured rather than crushed. Victoria surprised Derek by taking the morning off to attend Isla's first day. She arrived at breakfast dressed in clothes less formal than her usual executive armor, looking almost uncomfortable in casual slacks and a simple sweater. Isla noticed immediately, her observant eyes taking in the change with the seriousness she applied to anything involving the adults around her. "Are you coming to school with us, Miss Victoria? If that's all right with you?" Victoria's uncertainty was visible, a crack in the confidence she usually projected. "I thought you might want company on your first day." Isla considered this with the gravity of someone making an important decision. Then she nodded, her approval simple and absolute. Derek watched this exchange and felt the careful boundaries he had maintained begin to blur. This was not a transaction. This was not strategic positioning. This was Victoria choosing to show up for his daughter because Isla had asked, and because Victoria was learning that showing up mattered more than any amount of money or power. The school was smaller than Isla's previous one, housed in a converted mansion, with grounds that encouraged outdoor exploration. The headmistress greeted them warmly, focusing her attention on Isla, rather than on the adults whose complicated situation had been detailed in every major financial publication. She walked Isla to her classroom personally, introducing her to a teacher who seemed genuinely excited about having a new student mid-year. Derek stayed in the hallway, watching through the classroom window as Isla settled into a desk near the front, her nervousness visible but not overwhelming. A girl with dark braids and freckles leaned over to ask Isla a question, and Derek saw his daughter's face light up with tentative hope. Making friends, starting over, building a world that was hers instead of something defined by the chaos adults had created. Victoria stood beside him, silent but present, when the teacher closed the classroom door and gestured for them to leave. Victoria followed Derek back to the parking lot without comment. They sat in the car for several minutes before either spoke. "She's going to be fine." Victoria's statement carried conviction, as if saying it firmly enough could make it true. "I know." Derek stared at the school building, willing himself to trust the fresh start Isla was getting. "She's stronger than I give her credit for." "She gets that from you." Derek glanced at Victoria, surprised by the certainty in her voice. She was not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the middle distance in that way people did when they were thinking about something else entirely. I'm not particularly strong, I'm just stubborn. There's a difference between stubborn and having principles you refuse to compromise. Victoria finally met his eyes. I've built an entire career on compromise, strategic concessions, calculated decisions about which battles to fight and which to let go. It's how you succeed in corporate environments. It's how you survive when everyone around you is waiting for you to fail. But watching you refuse to bend on the things that matter has shown me what I've lost along the way. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, though the car was not moving. You told Marcus last night that resources can't buy integrity, that money can't manufacture character. I've spent 15 years believing the opposite, thinking that if I accumulated enough power, I could protect the things I cared about. But you can't protect anything if you become the kind of person who uses power like Marcus does. Derek understood what she was offering, even if the words were still finding their shape. An admission that this forced marriage had changed her as much as it had changed him. That somewhere between the desperation of the registry office and the battle they were now fighting together, Victoria had started to become someone different. The board hearing is in a week. Derek returned to the practical because emotions this complicated needed time to process. We should go over the timeline one more time. Make sure we can present the electrical surge evidence without gaps they can exploit. Victoria nodded, starting the car and pulling out of the parking lot. But Derek saw the slight curve at the corner of her mouth, recognition that he had not dismissed what she had said. He had simply chosen to honor it through action instead of words, the way he honored everything that mattered. Vivian arrived at the mansion that evening with boxes of documents and a strategy that involved connecting dots across 6 years of Marcus's and Reginald's corporate history. She spread everything across the dining room table, creating visual maps with string and pushpins that made the room look like a detective's war room from old movies. The pattern is clear once you see it. Vivian pointed to photographs of 3 different women, all former CEOs of companies where Reginald had worked as CFO. Each one faced a sudden board challenge within 6 months of Reginald's arrival. Each one had their personal conduct questioned. Each one was replaced by a male executive who Marcus Thornton had connections to. Derek studied the photographs, recognizing the same exhaustion in their faces that he saw in Victoria's during unguarded moments. These women had fought the same battle Victoria was fighting now, and they had lost. What happened to them after they were removed? 2 took settlements and disappeared from corporate life entirely. The 3rd tried to fight back through lawsuits, but Reginald had manufactured enough scandal around her personal life that she became unhireable. Vivian's voice carried the clinical detachment of someone reciting facts that made her angry. Marcus and Reginald have been running this playbook for years. Victoria is just the latest target. Can we use this in the hearing? Not directly. None of these women are willing to testify. The settlements they signed included non-disclosure agreements. Vivian shuffled papers, frustration evident in the precise violence of her movements. But we can present the pattern as context. Make the board ask why their chairman and CFO have a history of removing female CEOs under questionable circumstances. Victoria entered the dining room carrying coffee for all 3 of them, her presence shifting the energy in the room from analytical to strategic. She studied Vivian's visual map with the focus she applied to everything that mattered, absorbing the implications and calculating responses. We present this after Derek's testimony about the electrical surge. Victoria set down the coffee and began rearranging elements of Vivian's display. We let them think the hearing is about proving my marriage is legitimate. Then Derek shows them evidence of premeditation. Then Vivian shows them the pattern. By the time we're done, the question isn't whether I'm fit for leadership. The question is whether Marcus and Reginald are fit to remain on the board. It was elegant in its reversal, using the ethics investigation Marcus had demanded as a weapon against its architects. Derek recognized Victoria's strategic mind at work, the same intelligence that had built Hayes Global into a $4 billion company. But now that intelligence was being deployed in service of something beyond profit margins and shareholder value. Now it was about justice. They worked through the night refining their presentation and anticipating counter-arguments. Derek practiced explaining the electrical surge evidence in language that non-technical board members would understand. Vivian prepared legal briefs that connected Marcus's and Reginald's actions to established patterns of corporate misconduct. Victoria coordinated everything, her role shifting from defendant to prosecutor as she recognized the power of going on offense. Somewhere around 3 a.m, exhaustion caught up with all of them. Vivian dozed on the couch, legal briefs scattered across her lap. Victoria sat at the dining table with her head resting on crossed arms, too tired to maintain the rigid posture she usually enforced. Derek stood at the window watching snow fall across the grounds, thinking about Isla sleeping safely upstairs and about the battle they would fight in 7 days. This was not how he had imagined his life would look 6 weeks ago. Then he had been a single father struggling to make rent, taking emergency contracts to cover school expenses, promising his daughter that they would be fine, even when fine felt like an impossible standard to maintain. Now he was preparing to testify before a corporate board about conspiracy and corruption, living in a mansion with a woman he had married for reasons that no longer made sense, fighting a war he had not chosen but could not abandon. But somewhere in the chaos, something unexpected had emerged. A partnership built on mutual respect instead of transaction. An alliance where both of them were learning to value integrity over advantage. And the fragile possibility that doing what was right might actually matter, even when the cost was everything they had left to lose. The week before the board hearing passed in controlled chaos, Derek took emergency contracts during daylight hours to maintain the appearance that his life continued normally. But every evening was consumed by preparation. Vivian drilled him on technical testimony until he could explain power surge patterns in language anyone could understand. Victoria reviewed his presentation for gaps that Marcus's attorneys might exploit, her questions sharp enough to draw blood. Isla noticed the tension, her 7-year-old instincts reading the adults around her with uncomfortable accuracy. She asked fewer questions at dinner, finished her homework without needing reminders, and went to bed early without argument. Derek recognized the pattern from the months after Sarah died, when Isla had tried to make herself smaller to ease the weight pressing down on her father. It broke something in his chest to see her doing it again. On Thursday evening, 3 days before the hearing, Derek found Isla in the library where she had been reading. Her book lay closed in her lap, and she stared out the window at grounds turning purple with dusk. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Isla turned to face him, her expression carrying more gravity than any child should have to manage. "Are you and Miss Victoria going to get in trouble with the mean people?" Derek sat beside her, searching for words that would be honest without being frightening. "We're going to a meeting where some people will ask us hard questions. But we're going to tell them the truth, and the truth is on our side." "What if they don't believe you?" The question landed with precision, exposing the fear Derek had been trying to ignore. What if his testimony was not enough? What if Marcus's investigators had poisoned the well too effectively? What if doing the right thing mattered less than having the right connections and the deepest pockets? Then we lose, but we lose knowing we didn't compromise on what we knew was right. Derek pulled Isla closer, feeling her small weight settle against his side. Sometimes the world doesn't reward integrity. Sometimes telling the truth costs you everything. But the alternative is becoming the kind of person who uses lies to win, and that cost is higher. Ela absorbed this in silence, processing adult realities through a child's simpler moral framework. Then she asked the question that cut deepest. If you lose, do we have to go back to the apartment? I don't know yet. Derek would not lie to his daughter about something this important. The apartment's gone. The landlord rented it to someone else. But we'll find another place, we always do. I don't want to leave. Isla's voice was small but certain. I like it here. I like my new school. I like Miss Victoria. Derek felt the complications multiply, recognizing that his daughter had built attachments he could not simply sever without causing damage. Isla had already lost her mother. She had already survived upheaval and instability. Now she was facing the possibility of losing the fragile stability they had built in this unlikely place. Victoria appeared in the doorway, hesitating when she saw Derek and Isla together. She had changed from her work clothes into something softer, her hair loose instead of pulled back in its usual severe arrangement. She looked younger this way, more vulnerable, and Derek saw Isla's face light up with genuine affection. Can I ask the 3 questions? Isla's request was directed at both of them, including Victoria, in the ritual that had always belonged to just father and daughter. Derek nodded, curious to see how Victoria would handle this. She moved into the room and sat in the chair across from them, her posture less rigid than usual. Isla asked Derek first, "What made you happiest today?" "Seeing you make a friend at school. Sophie seems nice." "What made you saddest?" "Knowing you're worried about things you shouldn't have to worry about." "What do you want to change tomorrow?" Derek paused, meeting Victoria's eyes across the small distance between them. "I want to stop being afraid that doing the right thing won't be enough." Isla turned to Victoria, her questions carrying the same weight they held for Derek. "What made you happiest today, Miss Victoria?" Victoria's composure cracked slightly, surprise evident before she smoothed it away. "When you showed me your drawing of the garden, you made the snow look like it was actually falling." "What made you saddest?" "That I might not be able to protect the things I care about." Victoria's voice was quieter than Derek had heard it outside moments of exhaustion or defeat. "What do you want to change tomorrow?" "I want to learn how to be brave the way your father is brave. Not because I have power, but because I refuse to compromise on what matters." Isla smiled, satisfied with answers that felt honest instead of performative. She returned to her book, dismissing the adults with a child's casual authority. Derek and Victoria stayed in the library after Isla left for bed, the silence between them holding questions neither was ready to voice. "She's including you in her world." Derek spoke first because someone had to. "Not just as my wife or the woman whose house we live in, as someone she actually cares about." "I know." Victoria stood, walking to the window where Isla had been watching dusk settle. "That terrifies me more than losing the company. If we lose the hearing, if Marcus succeeds, Isla loses this place and this stability. And that's on me. I'm the one who created this situation. We both created it." Derek joined her at the window, their reflections ghostly in the darkening glass. "I agreed to the marriage. I brought Isla into this house. I knew the risks, even if I didn't fully understand the stakes. You agreed because I backed you into a corner, because I offered you resources for Isla that you couldn't refuse." Victoria's hands clenched at her sides. "I used your love for your daughter as leverage. That makes me no better than Marcus." "That's not true." Derek turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders firm enough to demand attention. "Marcus destroys people to accumulate power. You made a desperate choice to protect something you'd built. The methods were similar, but the motivations matter." "Do they? When the outcome is the same?" Victoria's eyes held genuine anguish. If Isla gets hurt because of what I started, if she loses the home she's found here, how is that different from Marcus destroying careers and lives? Derek did not have an answer that would satisfy her, so he offered truth instead of comfort. It's different because you're asking the question. Marcus would never care about the collateral damage. You do. That difference is everything. The morning of the board hearing arrived cold and bright winter sun reflecting off snow in ways that made everything look cleaner than it was. Derek, dressed in the suit Victoria had purchased for him, better quality than anything he had owned before, but still modest enough to avoid looking like costume. He checked his appearance in the mirror and saw someone who could pass for belonging in corporate boardrooms, at least until he opened his mouth and technical vocabulary replaced executive speak. Victoria appeared in the doorway of the guest room that had become his. Her own armor fully assembled. Charcoal suit tailored to perfection, hair pulled back severely, makeup applied with strategic precision. She looked like the ice queen the media had always claimed she was. Except Derek had seen her making pancakes with Isla, and knew the armor was exactly that, protection against a world that punished vulnerability. Are you ready? Derek nodded, though. Ready felt like an inadequate description for walking into a room where people with law degrees and corporate experience would tear apart his credibility. But he had the truth on his side, and he had become very good at explaining complex systems in simple language. That would have to be enough. The hearing took place in Hayes Global's main conference room, a space Derek had never entered before. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, glass and steel monuments to Capitol stretching toward a winter sky. The board members sat along one side of a massive table, Marcus Thornton at its center like a judge presiding over execution. Reginald Kemp occupied a seat 3 positions down, his expression carrying smug certainty that the outcome had already been decided. Victoria and Derek sat across from them with Vivian between them, 3 people facing 11 board members and their assembled attorneys. The imbalance was deliberate, designed to reinforce who held power in this room. But Derek had fought battles against worse odds and survived. Marcus opened with procedural language about the ethics review's purpose and scope, making it sound like governance best practices instead of political assassination. He outlined concerns about Victoria's sudden marriage and questions about her judgment in personal matters affecting her professional role. Every word was carefully chosen, reasonable on surface while carrying poison underneath. Then he invited the investigators to present their findings. A man in an expensive suit that screamed hired consultant walked the board through Derek's employment history, financial situation, and the timeline of his marriage to Victoria. The presentation made Derek sound like a calculating opportunist who had identified a vulnerable target and exploited her desperation. Every fact was technically accurate while being fundamentally dishonest truth weaponized through strategic framing. The board members listened with expressions ranging from neutral to sympathetic, though Derek could not tell if the sympathy was for Victoria or for themselves having to witness this uncomfortable situation. When the investigator finished, Marcus opened the floor for questions. A woman Derek recognized from photos as Claire Hendricks, who ran the audit committee, leaned forward. Mr. Callahan, can you explain the circumstances that led to your marriage? Specifically, why you agreed to marry someone you barely knew? Derek had practiced this answer until it felt natural instead of rehearsed. Mrs. Sinclair approached me with an offer that would secure my daughter's future. Educational funding, healthcare stability I couldn't provide on an electrician's salary. I agreed because I'm a father first, and turning down resources that would help my daughter felt like failing the most important job I have. So you married for money? This came from a younger board member. Derek did not recognize his tone, carrying accusation disguised as clarification. I married for my daughter's opportunities. The money was means, not motive. Derek met the man's gaze without flinching. If you're asking whether I would have married Mrs. Sinclair without the financial incentive, the answer is no. But if you're asking whether I've benefited personally from this marriage beyond knowing my daughter is secure, the answer is also no. Marcus interrupted before the questioning could continue. The concern isn't about your motives, Mr. Callahan, though they're certainly questionable. The concern is whether this marriage represents genuine family stability or a legal maneuver to circumvent trust fund requirements. Then let me address that directly. Derek pulled out the laptop Vivian had prepared, connecting it to the conference room display. I have evidence that this entire investigation was manufactured through illegal means. That someone accessed sealed trust fund documents by deliberately sabotaging security systems. And that the people questioning Mrs. Sinclair's ethics are guilty of far worse conduct. The room went still, board members exchanging glances that ranged from confused to intrigued. Marcus's expression darkened, but he maintained control, gesturing for Derek to continue while his eyes promised retaliation. Derek pulled up electrical system logs from the county administrative building, the same records he had reviewed weeks ago. 3 weeks before our marriage, the building where civil records are stored experienced a power failure. Security cameras went offline, access controls failed, and someone gained entry to sealed legal documents. He walked them through the technical details, explaining how power surges left specific signatures in circuit logs. How deliberate overload created patterns different from random equipment failure. How the surge originated from a junction box that required both building access and electrical system knowledge to manipulate. This wasn't an accident or equipment malfunction. This was premeditated sabotage designed to disable security during a specific time window. Derek pulled up the correlation between the power surge timestamp and the access logs for Victoria's trust fund files. The same evening, the electrical systems failed. Someone accessed documents that were supposed to be confidential. Documents that gave Mr. Thornton and Mr. Kemp the information they needed to orchestrate this investigation. Claire Hendricks was leaning forward now, her earlier sympathy replaced by sharp interest. You're saying someone on this board deliberately accessed sealed legal files? I'm saying the evidence points to premeditation and coordination. Derek pulled up the device registration logs showing that the access came from equipment assigned to Patricia Drummond, Marcus's executive assistant. The electrical surge was triggered from the executive floor of this building. Ms. Drummond's access card was used at the county building during the window when security was disabled. And the trust fund documents were accessed from her assigned device. Marcus stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. This is speculation based on circumstantial evidence. You're an electrician with a grudge against corporations that fired you. Your credibility is questionable at best. Derek had expected this. He kept his voice level, conversational, as if Marcus's outburst was simply another technical question to address. My credibility is based on 15 years of electrical systems experience. I was fired from Meridian Infrastructure for reporting safety violations that were later confirmed by independent review. I've spent 5 years rebuilding my reputation by doing work that meets code standards other contractors ignore. He turned back to the board, bypassing Marcus entirely. You can question my motives for marrying Mrs. Sinclair. You can investigate my financial history and employment record. But you can't dismiss technical evidence just because you don't like the messenger. These logs are facts, not opinions. The power surge happened, the access occurred, the correlation is documented. Reginald Kemp tried to deflect his voice, carrying false reasonableness. Even if we accept your interpretation of the electrical logs, that doesn't prove anyone on this board was involved. Ms. Drummond could have acted independently. She could have. Vivian entered the conversation now, her lawyer's precision cutting through corporate doublespeak. But Ms. Drummond has no personal motive to access Mrs. Sinclair's trust fund documents. She does, however, have a professional obligation to her employer. And her employer has a documented history of removing female CEOs under questionable circumstances. Vivian activated a second display showing the photographs and timelines she had compiled. 3 companies, 3 female CEOs, 3 sudden board challenges orchestrated within months of Reginald's arrival as CFO. 3 cases where Marcus Thornton had connections to the male executives who replaced them. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern. Vivian's voice carried the steel of someone who had spent weeks building an airtight case. Mr. Thornton and Mr. Kemp have been running this playbook for 6 years. They identify companies with female leadership, manufacture scandals around personal conduct, and replace them with executives they control. The board erupted in questions, multiple voices demanding explanations and denials. Marcus tried to maintain order, but his authority was crumbling, the careful narrative he had constructed disintegrating under evidence he had not anticipated. Reginald looked trapped, his earlier smugness replaced by calculation as he tried to find escape routes. Derek stood, letting the chaos settle before speaking. His voice cut through the noise, not through volume, but through the weight of absolute certainty. You thought you could bury me because I'm just a working-class technician. Destroy my credibility, paint me as opportunist, make people forget that I've spent my entire career refusing to compromise on safety and standards. You're trying the same thing to Mrs. Sinclair, manufacturing doubt about her judgment while ignoring that she's built this company into something her father never achieved. He moved around the table, positioning himself where every board member could see him clearly. But here's what you didn't understand. My expertise doesn't disappear when you question my motives. Mrs. Sinclair's competence doesn't vanish because you attack her personal life. And the truth doesn't change just because you have better lawyers and deeper pockets. Derek's gaze locked on Marcus, delivering words that had been building for weeks. You used law as a weapon. You manipulated trust, betrayed fiduciary duty, and endangered this company's integrity for personal gain. You did it thinking no one with real knowledge would challenge you in this room. I'm challenging you now, with evidence you can't explain away, in language this board understands. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus's face had gone rigid, all pretense of control abandoned. Reginald looked like he was calculating odds and not liking the numbers. The other board members sat frozen, processing the reversal of a trial that was supposed to end with Victoria's removal. Claire Hendricks was the first to recover. I move that we expand this ethics investigation to include the circumstances surrounding the trust fund document access and the pattern of CEO removals Mr. Thornton and Mr. Kemp have been involved with. 3 other board members seconded immediately. Marcus tried to call for order to maintain his authority as chairman, but the board had already moved beyond his control. Someone suggested suspending both Marcus and Reginald pending full investigation. Someone else pointed out that continuing the hearing under these circumstances was inappropriate given the evidence of manipulation. Victoria spoke for the first time since the hearing began, her voice carrying quiet authority. Before this board takes any action regarding my marriage or my position, I have a proposal that addresses the underlying concerns about governance and accountability. She distributed documents. Vivian had prepared a comprehensive restructuring plan that would redistribute voting rights and eliminate the trust fund's concentration of power. The proposal was radical, voluntarily surrendering the inherited advantage that had made her untouchable while creating transparent governance that would prevent future manipulation. My father built this company through control and consolidated power. I've spent 3 years trying to run it ethically within that structure, but the structure itself enables exactly the kind of corruption we've seen today. Victoria's words were precise, each sentence carrying weight. I'm proposing we change the structure. Distribute voting rights among shareholders based on transparent criteria. Eliminate the supervisory committee that would have replaced me. Create accountability that doesn't depend on trust fund provisions or board politics. The board members read through the proposal with expressions shifting from surprise to consideration. Victoria was offering to give up the very power Marcus had tried to seize, but on her terms and in a way that would prevent anyone from accumulating that kind of unchecked authority again. This is unprecedented. Claire Hendricks looked up from the documents, something like respect in her eyes. You're voluntarily surrendering control. I'm choosing legitimacy over inherited advantage. I'm choosing to earn authority through performance rather than demand it through legal structure. Victoria's gaze swept the board. If my leadership is worth preserving, it should be based on results and ethics, not on voting rights my father concentrated to maintain dynastic control. Marcus tried one final attack, his voice sharp with desperation. This is a distraction from the fundamental questions about your judgment and personal conduct. Your marriage is still questionable regardless of governance restructuring. My marriage is 6 weeks old and already more honest than most corporate partnerships in this room. Victoria did not flinch from Marcus's attack. Mr. Callahan and I entered this arrangement for wrong reasons, but we've built something real from those foundations. We're learning to trust each other, to value integrity over advantage, to do what's right even when it costs us everything. She stood, moving to stand beside Derek in a gesture of solidarity that needed no explanation. You wanted to investigate whether my marriage represents genuine stability. Here's your answer. I'm married to someone who refused to compromise his principles even when it destroyed his career. Someone who teaches my household staff about electrical safety. Someone who helps his daughter with homework every night and answers her questions with patience that never wavers. If that's not family stability, I don't know what is. The board chairman, an older man who had been silent through most of the hearing, cleared his throat. I think we need to table the personal ethics questions and focus on the evidence of potential criminal conduct regarding document access. Mr. Thornton, Mr. Kemp, you're suspended from board duties pending investigation. Mrs. Sinclair, your restructuring proposal will be presented to shareholders for vote. Marcus's face went white with rage, but he had no moves left. The evidence was documented. The pattern established, the board turning against him with the same efficiency he had used to attack others. Reginald stood and left without speaking, recognizing when battles were lost. The hearing dissolved into procedural discussions about investigation timelines and shareholder communication. Derek and Victoria sat together while Vivian handled the technical details, both of them processing what had just happened and what it meant. They had won, not through manipulation or political maneuvering, but through evidence and truth presented with clarity that could not be dismissed. Derek's expertise had mattered. Victoria's willingness to surrender power had demonstrated the kind of leadership Marcus could never fake. But the victory felt fragile, temporary, as if they had won a battle while the war continued elsewhere. The shareholder meeting happened 3 days later, a virtual session that connected investors from across the country. Victoria presented her restructuring proposal with the same precision she applied to quarterly earnings reports, explaining how distributed voting rights would create accountability while preserving operational efficiency. Questions came from shareholders who saw opportunity in chaos, from institutional investors worried about stability, from individual stakeholders who wanted reassurance that their investments were protected. Victoria answered each with facts and projections showing how ethical governance created long-term value that short-term maneuvering could never achieve. Derek watched from the side of the room, technically present but functionally invisible to the investors who cared only about returns and risk management. He saw Victoria command the room with intelligence that had nothing to do with inherited position, making the case for voluntary power redistribution in language that appealed to self-interest while serving principles. The vote passed with 67% approval, not unanimous, but decisive enough to create mandate. Victoria would remain CEO, but under governance structure that prevented the kind of concentrated control her father had wielded. Marcus and Reginald faced formal investigation. Their careers effectively ended regardless of legal outcomes. Hayes Global would rebuild its reputation through transparency rather than dynasty, through earned authority rather than inherited power. It was everything Victoria had said she wanted, and it left her looking exhausted rather than triumphant. That evening, Derek found her in the library staring at documents that outlined her new responsibilities and constraints. She looked smaller somehow, the armor she usually wore stripped away by victory that felt more like survival. "You won." Derek sat across from her, offering observation instead of congratulation. "I survived. There's a difference." Victoria set down the documents, her hands trembling slightly before she controlled them. "The restructuring means I have to earn my position every quarter. No safety net, no inherited advantage, just performance and results." "Isn't that what you wanted?" "I don't know anymore." The admission came quietly, vulnerability Victoria rarely showed. 6 weeks ago, I knew exactly what I wanted. Power to protect the things I cared about. Control to prevent people like Marcus from destroying what I'd built. But you've shown me that control and corruption are separated by thinner margins than I wanted to believe. Derek understood what she was not quite saying, the question she was building toward through indirect approach. The 6-month requirement is almost satisfied. Another few weeks and we'll have met the legal standard for the trust fund provision. "And then what?" Victoria finally met his eyes. "We get divorced and go back to separate lives. You find an apartment somewhere. Isla changes schools again and we pretend these weeks didn't happen. Is that what you want?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than Victoria seemed to intend. "But I don't know what I have the right to want. I bought your cooperation through your daughter's future. I trapped you in a situation you never chose. The fact that we've built something real doesn't erase how it started." Derek leaned forward, closing the distance between them. "You're right that the beginning was wrong. You manipulated me, and I let myself be manipulated because I was desperate. But everything after that has been choice. I chose to stay when I could have left. I chose to fight beside you when I could have protected myself. I chose to teach Isla that doing the right thing matters even when it costs everything." He reached across the space separating them, his calloused hand covering hers. "So here's my choice now. I stay if you keep choosing family the way you've learned to choose truth. I stay if you keep asking instead of demanding. I stay if you remember that power means nothing if it's built on compromising what matters." Victoria's eyes held tears she refused to let fall, her composure fracturing without quite breaking. "What if I fail? What if I revert to old patterns when things get hard? Then I'll tell you the truth and we'll work through it together. That's what partners do." Derek squeezed her hand gently. "We're not going to be perfect at this. We're going to make mistakes and hurt each other and struggle with baggage we both carry. But we'll do it while trying to be people our daughter can respect." "Our daughter." Victoria repeated the words as if testing how they felt. "Isla asked me today if I was going to be her mom now. I didn't know how to answer." "What did you say?" "I said I would like to be if she wanted that. If you wanted that." Victoria's voice was barely above whisper. She said yes immediately, like it was obvious and I was being silly for asking. Then she went back to her homework like she hadn't just offered me something I didn't know I needed. Derek felt something settle in his chest, a decision crystallizing into certainty. Then we stay. Not because of trust fund requirements or legal obligations, but because we've built a family from broken pieces and that's worth protecting. Victoria nodded, accepting the commitment even as her expression held uncertainty about deserving it. Derek did not have reassurances that would erase those doubts, so he offered presence instead. They sat together in the library while snow began falling outside, watching darkness settle across grounds that had stopped feeling like museum displays and started feeling like home. Isla found them there later, her pajamas printed with stars and her feet bare despite the winter cold. She climbed into the space between them without asking permission, settling in. Like she belonged there because she did. "Are you guys okay?" "You were in here a long time." Derek wrapped an arm around his daughter, pulling her close. "We're good, sweetheart. Just talking about what happens next." "What does happen next?" Isla's question carried curiosity rather than anxiety, trust that the adults would handle whatever complications existed. Victoria surprised them both by answering first. "We keep being a family, we keep showing up for each other, we keep choosing to do what's right even when it's hard." Isla absorbed this, then asked the three questions with the same ritual seriousness she brought every night. Derek answered first, then Victoria, then Isla herself. The questions were the same, but the answers had changed, reflecting new realities and fragile hopes. "What made you happiest today, Derek?" "Knowing we don't have to pretend anymore." Victoria, Isla asking if I could be her mom. Isla, both of you being here together. "What made you saddest, Derek?" "Years I spent alone after Sarah died." Victoria, realizing how close I came to losing this. Isla, nothing today. Today was good. "What do you want to change tomorrow, Derek?" "Nothing. Tomorrow can stay exactly like this." Victoria, "I want to learn how to braid hair without making a mess." Isla, "I want pancakes for breakfast." They laughed, the sound genuine and unforced, three people who had found each other through circumstances designed to break them but had built something stronger than anyone intended. 6 months later, the mansion looked different without looking changed. The marble floors still gleamed, the hallways still stretched in elegant symmetry, but Isla's drawings covered the refrigerator and Derek's tools occupied a corner of the mudroom. Victoria's home office had photographs on the desk now. Candid shots of family dinners and school events that tracked time through accumulated memories. Hayes Global operated under new governance structure, Victoria earning her authority quarterly through results that satisfied shareholders and maintained ethical standards her father had never valued. Marcus Thornton faced criminal charges for corporate fraud and conspiracy. His empire dismantled by investigators who followed the evidence Derek had provided. Reginald Kemp took a plea deal that included testimony against Marcus, buying lighter sentencing through cooperation. Derek had returned to electrical work but now served as safety consultant for community infrastructure projects, using expertise to prevent the corner cutting that had cost him his career years earlier. He was not Victoria's trophy husband, not a corporate executive trying to fit roles that did not suit him. He remained Derek Callahan, electrician and father, someone who kept promises and refused to compromise on what mattered. Isla flourished at her new school, making friends who knew her as herself rather than as the daughter of someone famous. She still asked the three questions every night, but now both Derek and Victoria answered their responses, tracking the evolution of a family built from necessity into something chosen and cherished. On a winter evening 6 months after the board hearing, Derek found Victoria in the kitchen attempting to make cookies from scratch. Flour dusted her clothes and frustration marked her expression, but she was trying, and that effort mattered more than success. "Need help?" Victoria gestured at the chaos spreading across the counter. I'm destroying Thomas's organized kitchen. This recipe makes no sense. Why would anyone voluntarily do this when bakeries exist? Derek moved beside her, reading the recipe and recognizing where she had gone wrong. He guided her through the corrections with patience learned from teaching Isla. Showing rather than telling, offering support without taking over. They worked together in comfortable silence, Derek's hands steadying Victoria's when she tried to rush steps that required precision. The cookies that emerged from the oven were imperfect, slightly burned on the edges and misshapen, but they tasted like victory over impossibility. Isla appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the smell of baking. She looked at her parents covered in flour, at cookies cooling on racks, at the mess they had created together, and smiled with complete satisfaction. Did you make these, Mom? Victoria's breath caught at the title, still new enough to carry weight. Your dad helped. I'm terrible at baking. That's okay. You're good at other things. Isla took a cookie, biting into it despite the heat. These are perfect. They were not perfect by any objective standard. They were burned and misshapen and probably too sweet. But they were made with effort and patience and the kind of care that could not be purchased or manufactured. They were proof that Victoria was learning to create instead of just control, to build instead of just command. Derek watched his wife and daughter together, recognizing that the family they had become was not the family he had imagined building when Sarah was alive. It was messier, more complicated, built from broken pieces and desperate choices that should never have worked. But it had worked because they had chosen day after day to value integrity over advantage, to choose truth over convenience, to become people worthy of the second chances they had been given. The 5-minute marriage in the registry office had been transaction born from desperation. But the weeks and months that followed had been choice, deliberate, and difficult, building something real from foundations that should have crumbled. Victoria had learned to lead through earned authority rather than inherited power. Derek had learned that vulnerability was not the same as weakness. Ayla had learned that family could be chosen as well as born. They were not the coldest people in any room anymore. They were warm and flawed and trying, 3 people who had found each other through circumstances designed to break them, but had refused to let those circumstances define what they became. Derek pulled Victoria close while Isla finished her cookie. The 3 of them standing in a kitchen that smelled like burned sugar and new beginnings. Outside, snow was falling again, covering the grounds in fresh white. That would melt and freeze and melt again through cycles that never quite erased what came before but slowly transformed it into something different. 5 minutes had created a contract. 6 months of choosing each other had created a family. And the years ahead would be built from the same foundation, showing up, telling truth, keeping promises, and refusing to compromise on what mattered even when the cost was everything. They had started as strangers bound by desperation. They had become partners through crisis and choice. And they would continue as family because they had learned that the coldest person in any room had never lacked a heart. She had simply never had anyone willing to stay long enough to help her remember how to use it.